Let me first introduce our speakers for this pre-recorded session. Professor Eric Hanushek is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University. He is internationally recognized for his economic analysis of educational issues and is the 2021 Yidan Prize for Education Research Laureate. Mr. Jaime Saavedra leads the Education Global Practice at the World Bank Group. He served as Peru's Minister of Education from 2013 through 2016. Professor Ludgar Versman is Director of the IFO Center for the Economics of Education and Professor of Economics at the University of Munich. He's also Distinguishing Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Our moderator for this panel is Ms. Barbara Bruns. She's Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University and joined the Center for Global Development as a Visiting Fellow in late 2015. Prior to that, as a lead education economist at the World Bank, she specialized in Latin American education and rigorous evaluation of education programs. At this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Ms. Bruns.
Rick, you know, when you completed your MIT PhD, I think really most economists were interested in macroeconomics topics, and that was really the route to academic prestige. What got you started working on education?
Well, I think that the prime motivation for my working in economics in the first place was to try to do things that help society and help people do better. And I wasn't sure how best to do that. I thought macroeconomics was maybe a little bit far removed from actually having an impact on people's lives. But when I was looking for a thesis topic, there was a major US study that came out called the Coleman Report that had the overwhelming conclusion that schools didn't matter. And I was sitting there and said, how could that possibly be? This sounds just crazy to me because we spend a huge amount of money on our schools and everybody believes that schools are important. How could it be that they don't matter? And that got me into studying what it was about schools that did have an impact. I should say at the outset that the Coleman team that found that schools didn't matter was right in one sense. The measured attributes of schools that they looked at to count for the quality of schools didn't matter. It wasn't how many laboratories they had or how much experience the teachers had. Those things were not consistently related to student achievement, but subsequently found first that schools had a big impact on kids, and it came through high quality teachers. And teachers were hard to measure what their attributes were and who was going to be most effective. But once you did that, you saw that schools were really important. So from this sort of accidental beginning, I just got on a path to try to figure out more about how we could improve our schools and what the impact of schools was on kids. And so that's how I got here today.
And I know these messages from Rick's work really resonate with you, Jaime. I mean, you've called on him to advise on the 2018 World Development Report. He's been, a speaker at many World Bank conferences on teacher quality, among other topics. So, is there anything particular about him or his work that gets him so much attention from the World Bank?
I think I can go back a little bit in time, and Barbara, because I bought Rick's book. Maybe he doesn't even remember it. His 1994 book, Making Schools Work. When I was just finishing my my dissertation on economics of education, essays on Peru, and so since then I've been looking at Rick's work. And actually, for me, a fundamental point is that there are many ways of measuring education quality. It's not easy. So it's a field that since then has continued growing and will continue as a critical field. But then that focus on teachers, right? And what are those characteristics of teachers that really matter? I think that has been absolutely fundamental in terms of the work of us economists working on education and in showing that education matters for growth. And that also came in the much later book with Longrun on the knowledge capital of nations, showing that education quality is critical for economic growth. So actually that's, I mean, all that body of research we're showing that education quality, the teachers is what matters, that education quality matters, the teachers is what matters, and then that has an impact on economic growth. I think that has been absolutely fundamental in order to position education as a key factor to determine the welfare of nations.
Absolutely. But all of that has been really jeopardized over the last 2 years with the pandemic. And Ludger, you and Rick were among the first economists to start really trying to analyze the economic impact of COVID-19. So I'd like you to say something a little bit about where things stand in terms of your findings on that. And then I know the World Bank under Jaime has been doing a lot to try to see who's really doing the best job of managing the education crisis due to COVID, and what lessons we're learning from countries that are doing better than others. So first, Rick and Ludger.
Yeah, I guess it's indeed a case where we're just continuously learning where we stand. So the point is, pandemic meant school closures, but it also meant beyond that a lot of disruptions for kids. So we will expect some learning losses there. That's the first part. And then the second part is how would learning losses affect economic losses? And I think on the first one, we are actually still at the place where we don't know too much, and it depends on lots of things. There's very few good data sets, very few good studies, because most of the testing that could tell us has been discontinued during the pandemic. And then if they're resumed, you had huge non-participation, particularly of poorly performing students, that can strongly bias what you find. There's one very good study from the Netherlands that I know of, and there's actually, I know many studies, but of different quality. And so they have very specific data where they can look at the learning gains of the students really like from just before to just after the closures, and they just had 8 weeks of closures. And what they find is that primary school students there lost equivalent of about 1/5 of a years of learning. And that's really basically the whole period during which the schools were closed in the Netherlands. And I guess most countries had much longer school closures, and so we should expect bigger losses there. But then it also depends on many other things. So for example, they show that it depends on parental education, and many studies have shown that like the family background is important. If you're learning at home, like if your parents can help you more, that will be much less of a problem. Our German evidence that we looked at also indicates another dimension where it's important, and that's students' prior achievement. So if you do distance schooling, learning at home, the one thing that's missing is the teacher in the room. And then we just heard how important teacher quality is, but if they are just gone, maybe high achieving students will be okay in doing like self-regulated learning. But if you are like, it's hard for you to understand. And what all the school is doing is telling you, look at the textbook, read the page, and then do the exercises. Even if they are motivated, they may read the textbook, don't understand it, and it's the end of it. That's where teachers would generally come in. And so what we see is that losses will be much larger for low achieving students. So it's the disadvantaged students in general who will be more hurt. But
I have to say, Ludger, that, when you talk about 8 weeks of school closure, I mean, most of the countries Jaime is working with have had almost 2 years of school closures, and absolutely no ability for students to receive online support because those resources aren't there. So at a global level, the problem is just enormous. But Jaime, maybe rather than sit here and all cry, maybe if you can point to any lessons or bright spots in developing.
Ludger is absolutely right on two things. First, that we don't have a lot of data because actually many countries are not willing to measure because they're going to get really bad news because the impact on this generation might be gigantic. And as you say, in the global south, we have many countries that have been between 1 and 2 years out of school. We have only little data actually, but we have some already for Brazil, for instance, for rural India, that actually point to an entire year lost in terms of learning. So, and we're really worried, and this the point that Luger was making is on inequality, right? Because actually the hit has not been the same for everyone. So we see vast differences between the rich and the poor, right? And the bottom 50 in even middle-income countries had no access whatsoever to any remote education, right? So there is a difference across the income scale. There's a difference because younger kids were it was much more difficult to receive any type of remote education. The role of the teacher is even more important in preschool and in primary. And finally, there's a huge inequality if we compare this generation with the previous and the next one, right? So unless we do something really today, and that's not a metaphor, today really means today, right? The impact on this generation might be gigantic. But in terms of bright spots, obviously, we need to close the digital divide. That's critical. But the thing that we have learned is actually that education is about human interaction. And education is about that relationship, that interaction between the student and the teacher. And again, goes back to the originals, Rick's research, right? That is the teacher and teacher's quality, what really matters for education. And if that was not evident, well, now with the pandemic is really evident. So actually the support today, technology is important. We need to do some stuff there, but actually the key factor is to support teachers today in terms of what they can do in the classroom today in order to try to recover the learning that has been lost or missed during this last 1 year, or in some cases, unfortunately, even 2 years in the Global South.
Barbara, could I just add one thing?
Sure, of course. The Yidan laureate can add whenever he wants.
I find the discussions of learning losses to be very frustrating, particularly in the United States, but in other places. In the United States, there's a mention that kids have been out of school, but the main focus of macroeconomists has been on, is this a recession like all other recessions? Are we getting unemployment down as fast as in prior recessions? And what's going on in the labor market and with firm closures and so forth? And these have missed the fact that this is not a normal recession, because in normal recessions, we don't close the schools. This has a long-run impact that is multiple times the cost of the unemployment that has been caused by COVID. And yet macroeconomists in the media have paid very little attention to that aspect of it. And I just reinforce what Jaime says, that now is the time. If we don't do something about it, this generation has been scarred and will pay the price of it for a long time, but nations will also pay the price, because the labor forces of nations are going to take a hit in terms of the quality of their workers in the future.
And that's actually really what Rick's prior work and then our joint work has also quantified, if you just think about it. So what we get, if you do rough projections based on past experiences of how important skills are for long-run growth, if just the current school cohort loses a third of a school year, that was what we talked about beforehand, long-run GDP until the end of the century will be 1.5% lower on average. But if you go to a whole year, like Jaime was just saying, it's basically it's going to be somewhere between 4 and 5%. And if it's 2 years, it's going to be as much bigger. So these are really big numbers. And the individual costs for the ones who are affected individually going to be even stronger. Their income losses will be tremendous.
And just one quick point on that. I mean, the numbers that we have calculated, for instance, in terms of loss of future earnings of this generation is about, in the Global South, about $17 trillion. Which is a gigantic number. And that's the income losses for this generation. That's not what Ludger is saying, which is the impact on growth of economies in general. But the key point here is that there is not enough internalization, right, by the whole macro financial complex, right, about the magnitude of this crisis. Not only the crisis today, but the impacts that this crisis might have in terms of future productivity, future welfare, and future growth. I think we are, as societies in general, we're not really taking this seriously in terms of the potential gigantic impact that this might have in the future.
So let's try to think about what are the best things we can do when in a typical developing country such as Peru, which is not going to reopen schools until next year. I mean, what are the things that school systems need to focus on to try to make the best of this horrible situation? I've heard people say foundational learning, really make sure that you focus more resources than ever on children in the first 2 or 3 grades so that they become literate, and the kids that were a little bit older and didn't become fully literate, really go after them. But all of that.
So look, we before the crisis, we were already living before the pandemic, we were already living a learning crisis, right? I mean, about half of children in the developing world were not able to read and understand a text by age 10. So that was already a gigantic crisis. Now that 50% or 53% is now calculated to go up to 70% of kids who are not able to read and understand a simple text by the end of primary. So as you're saying, Barbara, it is critical now to focus first of all in the foundational skills in literacy and numeracy, and make sure that kids are not losing that. We need to focus also in the potential, socio-emotional scars, right, on the kids who have been out of school, and this will require that teachers really need to focus the teaching and learning process on where the kids are today. I mean, it's you're receiving a 5th grader that has the capabilities of a 2nd or 3rd grader in terms of the base of his or her knowledge. So you cannot teach what you were supposed to teach. You need to teach wherever that student is today and build upon that. Now, that's not easy. That's complicated for teachers, and that's complicated because you need to readjust curriculums at the level of the school and the level of the classroom. But that's absolutely essential that that's done. So that's why I was saying the support that we need to give to teachers in terms of finding the right methods in order to have some sort of personalized learning at the classroom level is absolutely essential.
I have to just jump in here, excuse me, Rick, and say that I'm very happy to say that the other Yidan laureate for this year has really been working her whole life on exactly this issue of foundational learning, and their NGO Pratham has demonstrated results that it is possible to really compress the process of learning, teaching kids to become literate and basic numeracy, do it much better than traditional schools have been doing. So I'm very mindful of the time now. So Rick, did you want to add something on that?
Well, I just wanted to underscore that if we just get back to where schools were before the virus struck, if we get back to January of 2020 school quality, these losses are permanent. There are some people that go around saying, well, kids are resilient, they'll bounce back. But we have lots of past evidence to suggest that that's not the case, that the only way to make up for this is to actually make the schools better than they were going into the pandemic. And that's the challenge that not many countries have stepped up to yet.
Absolutely. But that's also a challenge that your and Ludger's research gives us a lot of help in facing. So I just want to give Rick a chance to talk about, one of the great things about the Yidan Prize is it gives you a pot of resources to try to make a difference in global education. And you've proposed a fellows program to build up a cohort of young African economists working on education. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
This work or this idea springs quite naturally from the work that Ludger and I have been doing. We've been trying to estimate the global value of better education. And when you do this, you see that Africa stands out as being quite far behind the rest of the world. And our work suggests very simply that economic growth and economic development depend crucially on the quality of the labor force. So that development in Africa, which a lot of people are concerned about, will only happen if we can get better education, better schooling for the kids. The idea that I am wanting to try out with the Yidan Prize money is trying to get better local decision makers on education, local in each country. It seems like we know a lot more about how to improve education than is actually being applied in many countries. And so the idea is that if we have local people who can understand both the capacity and the demands in the local countries of Africa, we have a better chance of putting in place these policies that would help the schooling. The idea of using the money is to have a select group of fellows who would, in fact, get bulked up on evaluation methods and ability to understand what is known about education. They would get linked into the network of worldwide researchers on these problems, but they would go back to their own countries and try to take what is known and put it in place. It's an experiment because lots of efforts have been made by the World Bank and by a variety of other organizations to improve the schools in Africa, and the progress seems to be very slow. And so we have to try something new, in my opinion.
And I think part of the idea is that these trained education economists would also help strengthen the capacity of think tanks within Africa to be a place of doing local research and spreading local ideas and organizing local consortia and conferences and things to try to make the links between the broader global research community and get more research going on education policy on the ground in Africa.
Precisely,
So,
and it's partly also having a network of people. If you survey various policymakers in a variety of countries and ask them, where do you get your ideas? It's usually what the neighboring country is doing as opposed to anything else. And so it's getting a network of people that are working together to try to improve things.
Great. And timeline for this interesting initiative?
Well, we hope to have fellows by next fall. We have to sort of put in place a selection process and advertising process and all the institutional structure, but have fellows in place by next fall, and then progressively add a small number of fellows each year till we get in 3 or 4 years to a number of people spread across sub-Saharan Africa with the skills and the interest and the ability to move the education in their countries forward.
And do I understand that these fellows would spend some time in Stanford and some time at Ludger's Institute in Munich also, or some time in Paris with OECD?
Precisely. The idea is that part of this is some little short courses, and depending on the quality of the people and their knowledge coming in, but part of it is developing networks around the world. It turns out that outside of developing countries, there's a pretty active network of worldwide researchers who actually interact on education policy issues. And we like to sort of crank up the ability of local African countries to participate in these networks.
Good. So I know you've taken the first step of getting in touch with some of the leading African economists working on education, and hopefully we'll be setting up an advisory board soon.
Can I make just one point on that? I mean, Barbara, absolutely, we can underscore the importance of building this type of networks in Africa. Definitely, the challenges that we have in terms of education quality are gigantic. I mean, I was saying before that about half of kids cannot read and understand a simple text by the end of primary. That number is like 90% in sub-Saharan Africa. So the challenges are immense and the needs are immense. And it's not only that we need to have good technical designs and good research. We really need to build a community that it can interact permanently with policymakers and with decision makers, because the challenge in Africa is not only having the right design, is to have the right implementation capacity at the country level, right? So one can provide a lot of technical advice and that's useful, that's great, but actually the real change will come if there is capacity at the country and at the local level. So building these networks is absolutely essential to make sure that there is that capacity there at the country to implement. In education, many of the challenges that we have is not that we don't know what to do, is the challenges to implement at scale. And that requires local knowledge, local capacity. And so this type of initiative is absolutely fundamental, and it's really, really needed in Africa.
Well, I hope we can take that, Jaime, that word of support is that you're interested in being involved in the initiative in some kind of advisory capacity as well. Thank you. Sure. So now I just want to do a quick round of like one sentence comments, responses from people. Rick, what would you say, looking back on, and one thing that's striking about your career is you've been very engaged with policymakers in the various parts, mostly of the United States. What would you say is the most gratifying example you've had of the direct policy impact of your work?
I think it has to do with evaluation of teachers in the United States. Now, a majority of the states in the US, in fact, require that evaluation of teachers be based sometimes almost entirely, but substantially on the learning gains of students. And this flows directly from work on value added of teachers and paying attention to what teachers are most effective to kids at all levels.
And Jaime, what's your message to researchers about what area they're not doing enough work in? What particular issues you'd like to see more research on?
Well, on that will require several sentences. So just let me link it to what Rick just mentioned. I mean, there's so many areas in which we need to do more, but one area is about how to improve teachers' quality and how to make sure that we have the right teachers in front of our students. The line of work that Rick just mentioned about evaluating teachers and how to link that evaluation to the student, right? At the end of the day, this is all about the student, right? We need great teachers. Because we need to make sure that there's a great teacher-student interaction, right? So at the end of the day, what matters is what's happening with the student, right? And actually, unfortunately, Rick's work will have to continue, right? And we'll need to popularize that work at the country level, still in many countries, right? Including my country, including in Peru, because not everyone has really understood that all decisions, all policy decisions that we need to take on education are all about the student, right? Sometimes that thing that sounds so obvious and that Rick's research had made so obvious, right? It's unfortunately not there in the policy decision-making process, right? So actually this work in terms of linking teachers and their performance, right, to what's really happening with students and use that, right, in terms of what our decision-making about teachers' careers, right, is absolutely a critical area, right? We have done a lot of research, but we need to continue doing more, and we need to continue linking that research to the decisions that are taken on a day-to-day basis at the country level.
Exactly. And I know that when you were Minister of Peru, you really focused on teacher policy and put in place these measures to change the way teachers are selected, to change the way teachers are supported, to change the way teachers are evaluated.
Exactly. So, I mean, this work of teachers evaluation, actually, that Rick started, I would say decades ago, right? That was at the heart of what we were trying to do with a new law, for a new teachers law, that it was about shifting towards a meritocratic career, a career that is about teachers' talents, teachers' performance, teachers' efforts, and in which way that has an impact on the student, right? So that meritocratic shift to a meritocratic career, actually, that was for us as an essential element of education reform.
But I don't think you paid him the royalties you owe him yet, or Peru owes him yet. Okay, last two questions. Rick, what's the best thing about working with Ludger?
Well, it always pays to have somebody who has similar interest and better skills than I have. And so we fit together quite naturally of an interest in how serious, rigorous scientific work can actually inform policies and lead to better outcomes.
And Ludger, what's the worst thing about working with Rick?
Oh, the worst thing.
I gave you time to do a whole list.
I have a long list on this one. So he's too productive. Whenever we sit together and discuss interesting things, we always come up with ideas and more research, and then Rick leaves it up to his co-authors to do all the hard and boring parts of the work. No, but if I really have to pick just one, I think it's the time difference between Palo Alto and Munich. So the worst thing is that he lives 11-hour flight away, so it's not easy to make sure that we find enough time to sit together and work, and it's always best to really sit together, and that's even worse during the pandemic, I guess.
So I want to thank all of you for stimulating discussion. I don't think we've solved all the problems of global education, but I think we have established that our Yidan laureate has already made incredibly important contributions to education. And with the help and support of the Yidan Prize, he's planning to do much more specifically to benefit Africa. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much to our panelists, and thank you to Barbara for leading our discussions. Now for our live Q&A, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Bernard Chan and Mr. Edward Ma on stage in Hong Kong, who will engage in conversation with Professor Eric Hanashek. A reminder to submit your questions by scanning the QR code on the back of your programs for those in Hong Kong, and by clicking the link in the live stream. Now, as our speakers sit down, let me tell you a little bit about them. Mr. Bernard Chan is a deputy to the National People's Congress of China, a non-official member of Hong Kong's Executive Council, and the conveyor of the non-official members of the Executive Council. He is also a former member of Hong Kong's Legislative Council. Mr. Edward Ma is Secretary General of the Yidan Prize Foundation.
Hi, and thank you for talking about time difference, and understand that you're staying up getting very late your time now. So thank you for joining us then. And also thank you, Bernard, for joining us in person today.
Thank you, Edward.
Yeah, we're receiving a lot of questions from the audience, and I guess the first question that we have here is actually for Bernard. They talk about pandemic has had a huge impact on education globally. What do you think is the biggest impact on education in Hong Kong?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to the Yidan Summit. Hong Kong is no different from other parts of the world. We all face the same the issues with school closures. But I have to say in Hong Kong, largely due to our very tough containments on the virus, school closed for only no more than about 3 months during the entire last 16, 17 months. Now, of course, I'm not saying with just only 3 months, lives of the students and the teachers are not affected. In fact, they're greatly affected. I think emotionally, as well as the quality of the education was impacted. But in addition to that, schools are largely now in Hong Kong in a half-day mode. They are open for half-day. So with schools only open for half-day, you can imagine for that very half-day, the courses are taught I was told that it's very cramped, and there's always going to be not enough time to teach out all the courses. So different schools have different ways to address the problem. Some do Zoom in the afternoon, some have additional support to the students. So that whole experience, of learning is never going to be the same. But this is going to be the new norm for at least for a little while, at least in Hong Kong. So it's the same sort of the issues. I was told that apart from the learning experience, it's also the students' social, emotional behavior. It's also been affected too along the way. And in terms of subject matter, I was told by many teachers, and together with also from the, I understand from the education department as well, that perhaps the subject on math is the most affected, because you do need to have perhaps the in-person learning in the subject of math. Whereas for other subjects that I guess it could be substituted by Zoom learning or or more textbook learning. So so it is a global phenomenon that we are facing, whether you're in Hong Kong or not. But particularly for Hong Kong, being Hong Kong is an international city, so we do have international student, international school versus local school. So what I just described earlier is largely the local setting. But among the international school, for those whose parents work in and out of Hong Kong, now their issues are slightly, in addition to what I just described, for them, they also see a movement of teachers, because some of them has been separated from the family for quite some time, so they need to return. So whether we can retain teachers in the coming academic year is also a new challenge, given that there is remaining this travel restrictions. So we have movement of teachers and as well as movement of students as well. Now, I forgot to also mention, even among local school, there are some movements of teachers as well. Some for perhaps whatever family reason they have to leave Hong Kong, or for those also perhaps want to move to other schools. So I think the issues of talent retention is also perhaps also quite an imminent issue as well.
Yes, certainly a lot of things to think about. So the second question, actually going back to Rick, you mentioned about the quality of labor force impact the economic growth and economic development in the future. So not all economies are capturing data about impact of school closures on our economy. How do we begin to measure this impact, and what advice could you give us to economies trying to capture this data?
Well, the real problem with education is that you don't see the results for a number of years. We have students that are, in fact, learning a lot less and will be less prepared when they go into the labor market, but we won't really feel the effect of it for a number of years until they're out into the labor market. What we've been trying to do is to guess, more than guess, to use past information about how the quality of schooling and the achievement of students will eventually have an impact on the economy. And that's what we talked about in the previous discussion. Very few countries today are even measuring the performance of their students currently. They did it in the past, but they stopped because they knew that there was a disruption and that the students weren't doing as well. But that's just the wrong answer. The right answer is that we have to be aware of how large the problem is and where it's most severe, which students are most affected, so that we can devise ways to deal with the pandemic.
Any thoughts on this in the context of Hong Kong, Bernard?
On the topic of evaluation of teachers, I think I've been reminded many times, there is no one set formula. And it's dangerous to get into that discussion of how best to evaluate. But I think what is needed actually for Hong Kong is perhaps for the various stakeholders to come together to at least have an open dialogue on this subject. Because I can assure you the expectations are never going to be met by different stakeholders. I'm sure the employers, their parents, and they all have a different take to what a good education is. So I think for a subject that sensitive requires an open and constant dialogue among those stakeholders. I'm not so sure there will ever be a specific formula, but I look forward to Rick's research, and perhaps I was jokingly saying to Charles Chan, Yidan Prize, that should consider this as the next award, if anyone can come up with a solution to best to evaluate the so-called quality of education.
Thank you. And the next question is for Rick. So you mentioned that the education is hit harder in developing countries than in developed countries. So what are the long-term implications, and how many years are sort of set back due to the pandemic in your view?
Well, what we had seen internationally is that there was the beginning of improvement of the schools in many developing countries before the pandemic. Countries were beginning to really focus on what the learning was. They already made a lot of effort to make sure that everybody was in school, but then they turned from just being in school to what the kids were learning in schools. That was reversed with the pandemic in a large number of countries. There was no ability to provide distance learning very well, or any internet service or whatever that developed countries have found. And essentially education stopped in a large number of countries. It is going to be years before we can make up for that. And that means that we have to really redouble our efforts to try to improve the schools. This is the challenge. We've been internationally trying to aid the development around the world for a long time, but we now see that that's a function of the quality of the schools, and we have to really get to that business.
Thank you. I'm probably heading to the last question, unfortunately, for the limited time we have. The next question is, again, for Rick. The East Asia had high levels of investments in the 1980s. How do you see that sort of investment earlier on have impact now 20 years on?
Well, we can see it by just looking around Hong Kong. The development of Hong Kong over the last 2 or 3 decades has been enormous. And the contrast between East Asia, which was really undeveloped 50 years ago, to where it is today, is so dramatic. And it's a contrast with the other parts of the developing world. If we look back 50 years, Latin America looked like it was way ahead of East Asia in terms of both the schooling levels in Latin America and the economic activity in Latin America. And nobody today would even think of comparing East Asia to Latin America in terms of either the schools or the economic development that we've seen.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rick. And thank you, everybody. We'll come to a close of this session. And thank you, Bernard. Again.
Thank you.